Hello, Tara here again. We're on chapter 9 of Not by Sight. This one's not too long. Where shall we go today, Lord Roxwood? Jack sat in the Daimler and deliberated a moment before he said, I'll let you choose today, Miss Mabry. Once we arrive, you can describe the place, and we'll see how well I'm able to pinpoint our location. Margate? No, he said, his pulse accelerating. I do not know that city well. Choose from one of the country roads closer to the estate. You understand? I do not wish to go to Margate. His insides clenched at the thought of venturing into such a public place. The village had been difficult enough, knowing how they stared at him. What if we become lost on one of the country roads? Her anxious tone drew his attention. You had better make certain your powers of description are adequate. Or shall I have Edwards accompany us? No, that won't be necessary. Jack heard her resolve an instant before the car leapt forward along the gravelled drive. He sensed her turning left moments later. Assuming they had passed the gatehouse, away from the direction of Margate, he eased back in his seat. I know I would have enjoyed Margate. Her consuming interest piqued his own. You seem keen to visit that city, Miss Mabry. Have you ever been there on holiday? No, but I've seen photochromic prints of the harbour and jetty, and London's National Gallery has on display several oil paintings of the coastline by the artist J.M.W. Turner. Margate looks beautiful. She paused, then added, I expected to go, but now things have changed. How so? Jack leaned forward in the seat. Had he missed a chance to get at the truth? He could still have her turn around and discover why she seemed so bent on going to Margate. He wrestled with his discomfort and lost. Frustration coursed through him. Perhaps Marcus was right to doubt his ability for the task. What's changed? He asked. The WFC is delivering hay to the train station at Margate today, she said. I would have been assigned to drive the team, but Lucy's taken my place. It's not likely I'll ever get to go. Ah, yes. They move the bales by rail to Folkestone, and then ship them overseas. Her reasons seemed innocent after all. A dog's loud barking made him grip the door's edge. We're entering Roxwood? He could hear a woman hawking fresh bread to his right, doubtless the old crone Maeve, who had been selling loaves from her cart since he was a boy. Correct, Grace replied beside him, but that's far too easy a test for you. We're going beyond the village. As the Daimler made slow progress along the cobbled main street, Jack imagined all eyes on him. It truly is a charming little town, she said, and he could tell she tried to put him at ease. With the prettiest colored shops, apple reds and forest greens, with a few gray structures the color of the sky just before a good rain. Thank you, Miss Mabry, but as I already know where we are, your colorful descriptions, while illuminating, aren't necessary. Fine. I won't say another word until we get to our destination. Then let's see how well you do. Jack smiled as he envisioned her feathers ruffling. My success will rely solely on the accuracy of your description, he said, releasing his grip on the door. The sounds on the street dimmed, and he perceived the curiosity of onlookers. Even Maeve had stopped her hawking. Only the dog seemed oblivious as it continued to bark. Freak. No doubt they all gaped at him, just as they had last week. He considered Grace Mabry, how after the first morning she'd questioned him about the mask, she'd never mentioned it again. The Daimler picked up speed, and Jack knew they had left the village. The car's motion and the warm country air lulled him into a drowsy state. He began dreaming the same nightmare he often experienced, those moments before the man disguised as Chaplin dove over the side of the ship, and Jack, watching in fury, unable to go after him, then turning to seek out the captain. An explosion, followed by blackness. A hand touched his shoulder. Jack jerked forward in the seat. Are you all right? Perfectly, he said, his voice groggy. You fell asleep? Just dozing. he said. It's a very warm morning, and I didn't sleep well last night. Did you have a nightmare? Please pay attention to the road, Miss Mabry. He didn't want her prying into his inmost thoughts. Have we arrived at this destination of yours yet? We have. Her voice came across low and teasing, and Jack found he liked it when she spoke to him that way. It's a good thing you fell asleep and didn't detect all of my turns. This will prove to be your greatest challenge. He smiled, enjoying their little game. All well and good, Miss Mabry, but you must describe our location as though you're writing a story for Women's Weekly. I'll pretend I'm the editor, and I won't settle for mere trees and bushes. Agreed. He heard her car door open. Moments later, she opened his. Would you care to stretch your legs, Mr. Editor? He slid from the seat to stand against what felt like hard-packed earth. The sun beat down against his shoulders despite his layers of clothing. Without the car's roof as protection, the mask soon became uncomfortably hot as well. Ready? She asked. He could imagine her scouring their surroundings for markers. She cleared her throat and began. The road is little more than a well-traveled horse track, arcing wide across an endless green pasture. On one side, weathered, criss-crossed timbers hem in dozens of black-faced sheep grazing with their lambs beneath the warm rays of sun. The other side opens out to more grassland and a smallish, oblong pool of mossy green water, surrounded by 3 majestic willow trees. The pool is fed by a narrow creek, stumbling over large white rocks and running off in the distance. She paused. Well, can you guess where we are? Jack was amazed at how much she'd improved on her descriptive passages. She made it almost too easy for him. You've just described the northeast edge of Miller's farm near Barden. A few minutes ago, we would have passed the gate and a sign that read, Welcome all travelers. Am I correct? Very good. She sounded equally impressed. Does this mean you'll purchase my story, Miller's Farm, for publication, sir? Hearing the laughter in her tone, he was pierced with a longing to see her face. Most assuredly, Miss Mabry, he said. I will publish it straight away. Thank you. She did laugh then, before adding, Are you by chance smiling under there? How was it she surprised him at every turn? And if I was? A sudden desire to show her battled his fear of her rejection. I should like to see it, of course. Her voice held a hint of exasperation. I did catch a glimpse of you in the hedge maze, after all. What I mean is that you have quite a nice smile, when you're not growling at the world. She enjoyed his smile? Still, his fear won out. I believe I have more to growl about. Why is that? When you possess wealth, title, and enough land to start your own country. He scoffed at her naivete. What is any of it without my sight? Lands, estates, even my prize-winning rose garden. What purpose do they serve when I cannot see them? You can smell your fragrant roses, sir. As for your lands, they provide the good food on your plate at table. You warm yourself by the fire with wood felled and chopped from your forests. And you can do this at any one of your estates. Simply because you're here right now and not in some muddy trench in France is something to smile about, don't you think? Is this the part where I'm supposed to feel ashamed of my attitude? How dare she minimize his injuries against his greater material wealth? I hate to disappoint you, Miss Mabry, but I'd beggar myself in an instant to glimpse another sunset, or to watch the way the wind and sun dance together like diamonds tossed across Camden Pond, to appreciate the sight of a beautiful woman. His thoughts returned to his goddess in green, so long ago. I'm afraid living in darkness has obliterated any gratitude I might have felt. My intent was not to shame you, sir, she said quietly. I only remind you that you do have blessings, and you have gifts, your remarkable sense of direction, and the knowledge of your surroundings. I doubt any could navigate as well in the same circumstances. Yes, in the same circumstances, he snapped, breaking the tenuous bond between them. Was he so pathetic, So starved for company in the outside world, he was willing to ignore who her father was and what he'd done? How would she react to the knowledge? Or did she already know? I hope you never have to endure it, Miss Mabry. Now take me home. Back at the farm, Grace found Becky waiting for her. Are the others back from Margate? She asked briskly, still frustrated over her outing with Lord Roxwood. No, said Becky, and Claire and Mrs. Vance are mending tarpaulins in the village, so you'll work with me. The red-cheeked woman pointed toward a table and a pair of wash-tubs beneath the lean-to attached to the barn. Another wash-tub filled with steaming water sat over a lit brazier just beyond the overhang. The gamekeepers killed the poultry, but the kitchen boy went home sick. Mrs. Riley wants us to clean them. The oolong-colored eyes pierced hers. Ever plucked a chicken before? Grace swallowed and shook her head. The only time she'd encountered chicken was in the form of coquenville, or the fricassee that Amanda, the Mabrys' cook, served them at supper. Aren't the Land Army girls supposed to do that? Her voice had raised a notch. When will they arrive? Becky shrugged. They're not here now, are they? So we've been volunteered. Again. She grinned. Come on, I'll teach you how. Grace followed Becky to the table. Her breath caught at the sight of so many dead birds piled high in one of the wash tubs. The other tub held water. Plucking chickens is easier than you think. Becky grabbed one of the birds by its feet and took it to the tub of simmering hot water. Just dunk it 2 or 3 times to loosen the feathers, like this, she said, illustrating for Grace. She returned to the table with the steaming bird and began removing feathers with ease. Go ahead, give it a try. Grace went to the wash-tub and gingerly took hold of a chicken. She held it away from her and walked toward the tub of hot water, repeating the process Becky had just shown her. A smell like wet dog rose to her nostrils, and she nearly gagged as she made her way back to the table with the soggy, steaming bird. Taking up the place across from her co-worker, she began pulling feathers. Good job! Becky beamed as Grace held up her first perfectly plucked chicken. Looks like you've been doing this all your life. Why, thank you, Grace said, warmed by her praise. Oddly, the smell of the wet feathers wasn't nearly as overpowering as it had been before. She laughed. This is definitely not something they teach you in finishing school. Becky showed her how to tie off the bird's feet and hang it from one of the nails protruding from a joist inside the lean-to. We'll take them to the larder when we finish, she explained. They need to hang a few days to tenderize the meat. They continued plucking chickens, with Grace's thought returning to her morning with Lord Roxwood. Yet another pleasant outing turned sour because she couldn't keep her tongue in her head. Determined to put it from her mind, she glanced up at Becky and asked, So, how did you end up in the Women's Forage Corps? When Agnes and I arrived, you said your family lived near Margate. Did you hear about joining there? Becky nodded. My family lives in the village of Westrun, but my pa's a fisherman out of Margate. He also works at the train station, loading freight when the fish aren't running. I used to walk into town and bring him supper. While I was there, I'd speak with a few of the locals, and that's how I learned they needed women to help with farming and baling hay. She paused to retrieve another chicken, then took it to the pot. We didn't live on a farm, but I figured I was strong and could learn to do the work. She called before returning to the table. I'd also be helping out my family. With 9 brothers and sisters, my pa has to work hard to make ends meet, especially with our appetites. Grace had not noticed Becky's second and third helpings at supper, yet she kept silent. Hadn't her blabbering already gotten her into enough trouble today? I do like to eat, said Becky matter-of-factly, reading her thoughts as she grabbed another fistful of feathers. Working at a farm instead of a factory means better food. Why, I've never seen so much in my life. She held up the chicken she'd been plucking. Even the army rations taste good, and Mr. Tillman gives us all the fresh fruit and vegetables we can eat. I get to go to bed with a full belly each night and send money home. She glanced up. My younger sister Ruthie catches a lift to Roxwood every other Sunday. I meet her after church and give her my earnings to take to our mum. There was more to Becky Simmons than she'd first imagined, Grace decided with admiration. Do you have plans for after the war? Becky shook her head. We've been fighting for so long I hadn't stopped to think about what I'll do when it's all over. One day our soldiers will defeat the Germans, Grace said, and tried to quell her anxiety over Colin's lack of correspondence. You'll have to consider your future. You're a smart woman to weigh all the benefits before deciding to join the Women's Forage Corps. She paused. You bake the most marvelous yeast rolls and barley bread. Why, your crumpets with butter and jam are the best I've ever tasted. Have you considered owning a bakery? How did you know? Becky gasped. I used to dream about having my own shop. I'd bake fresh breads, meat pasties, sausage rolls, scones, even tea cakes just like the bakery in Margate. Only my shop would be in my family's village. That way I could be close and take care of them. Determination lit the oolong-colored eyes. I'd make sure they never went hungry. There's nothing to stop you, Becky. She snorted. I've got little schooling and not a farthing to spare. I can bake, but it won't buy me a shop. Women's suffrage will change that, Grace insisted. Once we win the right to vote, we'll enact laws to help more women like you get the means to start a business. You could go back to school if you wish, or apprentice at the Margate Bakery, and one day taking over the running of their shop. When Becky seemed uncertain, Grace added, Anything is possible. You need only try. With your wits and your fearlessness for hard work, I believe you shall succeed. Becky smiled. I hadn't thought about the dream for a long while, but when you put it like that, maybe I do have a chance. No doubt about it. Grace reached for another chicken in the tub. Who would have thought one day I'd be plucking chickens? They gazed at each other over the enormous pile of feathers and laughed. So how was Margate? Grace asked at supper that night. Snatching another one of Becky's delicious rolls from the basket, she broke it apart and dunked it into her soup, feeling freer than she had in a long while. Not only had she plucked dead chickens all afternoon, but now she was being coarse while eating her food. Da would have such a fit at such vulgarity. It's a busy town. Sorry, I gotta get my French accent on. It's a busy town with miles of seashore, Agnes said, before tucking into another spoonful of Ida Vance's hearty bean and vegetable soup. Yes, and we met more WFC women at the stations, who reweighed and loaded our bales onto freight cars, Lucy added, and such sights in the bustling place. There was a kind of amusement park next to the railway, but I didn't get to go in and see it. She glanced toward Agnes. I had to wait with the horses while Mr. Tillman searched for Agnes. Grace paused in taking a bite of her biscuit to stare at her maid. What happened? This will sound silly, miss, but I got lost, Agnes said, her cheeks turning a bright hue. She stirred the soup in her bowl. Lucy said Mary hadn't eaten this morning, and that the mare seemed sluggish on the way to town. She wanted to try giving her some ginger powder, so I offered to fetch it from the Margate chemist while she stayed with the horses. Mr. Tillman went to buy a new belt for the steam baler at the hardware shop, Lucy supplied. When he returned and Agnes was still gone, he went to find her. I must have taken a wrong turn outside the chemist's shop, Agnes said. For about an hour it felt like I walked in circles. I was so relieved when Mr. Tillman finally found me. She shook her head. I can't believe it. In the last few weeks it seems like we've traveled over half the country, yet I ended up turned around within a few city blocks. I have no idea if this French accent is any good. Sorry. The others smiled as Grace reached for Agnes's hand. Well, I'm glad all ended well. But surely you must have been frightened being gone all that time. She recalled her own harried experience getting lost in the hedge maze. Agnes nodded, all humor gone. Grace could feel her maid's hand trembling beneath her own. I admit it was an alarming experience, one I don't wish to repeat. Well, Pierpont, you had an adventure today, Mrs. Vance said. Next time, you must ask directions. She turned to Grace. Mabry, Simmons tells me you did a fine job plucking chickens today. I think you were meant for farming. This brought a round of chuckles from the others, and even Agnes smiled. I'd hardly make a decent farmer, Grace said before a yawn escaped her. Though I am learning the meaning of hard work. I don't think I've slept so well in a long time. Grace couldn't sleep that night. The others had gone to bed an hour ago, while she lay awake in the semi-darkness. Already she'd gone over her journal notes twice in her mind, pleased over her colorfully detailed passage about her adventurous chicken plucking that afternoon. She'd also written of Agnes's ordeal at Margate. She embellished her notes a bit for a future story, beginning with how her friend had been kidnapped by pirates, but then changed her mind. Instead, she penned how Agnes found her family among the Belgian refugees arriving daily to Britain's shores. They convinced her to move north with them, and no one at Roxwood ever heard from her again. Her forehead creased. A happy ending for Agnes and her family, perhaps. But what about those she left behind? Grace hadn't forgotten the photograph in Agnes's bag. The knowledge that her friend withheld secrets from her still hurt. She rolled over and again closed her eyes, yet her mind refused to sleep. The entry where she'd written about her morning outing with Jack Benningham sprang into her thoughts. Grace smiled into the darkness, recalling his promise to publish her story, Miller's Farm. Even if he had only been teasing, as a novelist one day she knew his endorsement would most assuredly help. The harsh exchange they'd shared afterward came to mind, and her smile faded. He'd been so angry, yet she only meant to point out his life wasn't over simply because he couldn't see. Jack Benningham seemed eaten up by bitterness, his convalescence more a means to turn away from his family and the society of his friends, perhaps even his faith, if he'd ever had any. Grace sighed against her pillow. Jack Benningham needed God in his life. She fancied pulling up with the Daimler tomorrow morning and whisking him off to church in one of Reverend Price's sermons. Of course, he would likely fire her on the spot. Well, he couldn't stop her praying for his miserable, pocked soul. The sound of a bed creaking nearby caught her attention. Someone was moving. Grace turned her head, and with her eyes accustomed to the dark, she spied the silhouette of her chicken-plucking companion. Becky Simmons gathered her trench coat and a pair of boots before making her way stealthily toward the bedroom door. The woman hardly needed her boots to visit the indoor privy. Curiosity burned in Grace as she too rose from her bed and grabbed similar clothing. She intended to follow Becky downstairs, but before she reached the bottom step, the front door to the gatehouse had opened and closed. Shoving her feet into the boots, Grace rushed outside. Becky rode her bicycle toward the farm. The last streaks of light had faded from the sky, the half-moon glowing brightly. Grace hopped on a bicycle and rode in pursuit. What was Becky doing? Her mind raced, along with her feet on the pedals. Did she have some secret assignation? Perhaps a boy from the village, or one of the young soldiers returning home. Grace pedaled faster. Becky was going to open her own bakery one day. The last thing she needed was to get into trouble. Becky stopped at the barn. She leaned her bicycle against the siding and turned to scan the area. Then she walked past the overhang and disappeared from view. She was meeting someone. Grace pedaled up to the barn and abandoned her bicycle. Following past the chicken coops and pig pen, she saw Becky enter a familiar cottage-sized stone structure beyond the vegetable garden. She was meeting her sweetheart in the game larder? Grace edged toward the entrance. The door was closed, so she moved around to the side where a window allowed her to see. Even in darkness, she spied the stocky woman removing 3 of the birds they'd hung earlier. Dawning struck, and without further consideration, Grace went inside. "Becky, please stop." She heard a series of thuds as the chickens hit the stone floor. "Grace?" Panic-laced Becky's whisper. "You followed me here?" "Your sister Ruthie comes to town tomorrow, doesn't she?" Grace said by way of answer. "You're going to send those chickens home with her?" A sob tore through the dark. "Lord Roxwood has so much," she cried. "And the last time Ruthie was here, she told me Pa hurt his back at the freight station. He can't work. I didn't think anyone would notice 3 chickens gone." "God would notice, Becky. And so would you." Grace spoke gently. "Please, don't do this. Stealing is wrong, regardless of how many chickens Lord Roxwood has in his possession. You must have faith. Things will turn around." "How, Grace?" Becky's tone held a ragged edge. "What I send home barely helps." "You're being tested right now, don't you see? Is your peace of mind worth 3 chickens?" "It is," Becky said in a mutinous tone. "Having peace is fine when your pa is rich, but mine is poor, and you have no idea what it's like to worry if you'll have food enough to eat." "You're right. I've never gone hungry, but I know what it's like to be frightened. I also know fear can sometimes make us do things we regret." An image of her mother's lovely face, her look of hurt, flashed in Grace's mind. "Afterward, we are never the same." "I can't imagine you having any regrets." Grace tried to blink away the image. "Oh, I'm human enough. I've had my share." Then, sensing Becky's capitulation, she added, "Tell me, will you be able to sit in church tomorrow with a clear conscience, or not?" A shadow of movement caught her eye as Becky bent to retrieve the chickens, and then rehung them from the ceiling hooks. "All right," she said tiredly. "We'll try it your way. I just hope Faith will put food on my family's table." "You won't regret it," Grace said, relieved. "Now, let's get back before we're missed." Becky followed her outside, and the 2 returned to the gatehouse and slipped upstairs. Lying in bed, Grace stared into the darkness a long while before she finally closed her eyes. She smiled, knowing how she might help Becky's faith along. That was a bit obvious with the message there. Okay. I'm trying to remember. Has she talked about her mom before? I don't remember.